So we're very grateful that the Renaissance Center has been hosting us for these many years in person and remotely. And we're meeting remotely today because our speaker came down with COVID and he apologizes for the fact in advance he may have some hoarseness or difficulty speaking, but we're all glad to be here. We're also very glad to be where we are. And so we'd like to acknowledge that we meet on Nonotuck land. We acknowledge as well the neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, and the Abenaki to the north, as well as these communities that still live among us here on their native land. As we get going, then, I just want to say a few words of introduction about our speaker, Benjamin Braude. We've known him for a long time. He teaches at Boston College, but he's also held appointments at many places. He's got an appointment at Smith as an associate of religious history, a research associate. He has taught at Harvard, Princeton, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and as well in Madrid and at Oxford. Ben is a man of many talents. He works at the intersection, among other things, of European and Middle Eastern relations. He's done a great deal of work on Sephardic Jewry. He's written about questions of identity and race in intercultural situations, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian. And I think, as far as a personal collection goes, I think that Jim and I met Ben the first time when we were all taking part in a literature seminar that Jim was running, and there was a presentation on Kafka. And then I believe we, closer to home here with his fields of interest, we ran into each other at the American Historical Association when he was speaking at a panel about Jews and genetics and identity. And so in a sense, some of those themes continue today with the question of ethnicity and identity, but in a very different context when he speaks about the tangled and fascinating history of publications by mystic and philosopher Simone Weil. And so without further ado, we'd like to welcome Ben for his talk.
Thank you for joining this podcast. My gratitude to Jim Kelly of Amherst College and Jim Wald of Hampshire College, co-chairs of the 5-college book history faculty seminar, for hosting this talk and the discussion that followed on Wednesday, 5 March 2025, and to Jeffrey Goodhind of the Kinney Center for Interdisciplinary Renaissance Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for handling the technical aspects. Daniel Jocelyn Siemiatkowski, director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College, with the help of the associate director, Camille Fitzpatrick Markey, graciously agreed to accept it for the center's YouTube channel. I thank them as well. Unfortunately, on 5 March, I was beset by COVID, hampering the original delivery. Accordingly, we agreed to a re-recording, in the process slightly revising the original lecture while retaining the Zoom discussion and chat with the worldwide audience of the many dozens in attendance. For this enhanced version made on Wednesday, 30 April, I thank Courtney Breslin, Manager Video Services in the Boston College Media Technology Department. La pesanteur et la grâce, Gravity and Grace in English, the first book attributed to Simone Weil, was the product of intellectual fraud and theft perpetrated during and after the Second World War. The perpetrator manipulated her writings to render them consonant with the spirit of Marshal Philippe Pétain's Nazi collaborating Vichy regime. The work had been extracted, digested, and distorted from a manuscript that had been illegally retained, in effect stolen, from Holocaust survivors, the rightful heirs, Father Dr. Bernard Weil and Mother Mrs. Selma Reinherz Weil. La pesanteur et la grâce and much that followed were poisonous fruit. Almost nothing in the posthumously published oeuvre of Simone Weil and the telling of her life has escaped the consequences of what the perpetrators did to her and her family. Consequently, almost everything must be told afresh. This image is taken from a 24 May 1946 contract between the Paris publisher Plon and a certain Gustave Thibon of Saint-Marcel d'Ardèche. Their purpose was to produce a book bearing the name Simone Weil, whom in the opening lines of the his her book that was to appear a year later, Thibon pointedly introduced as a Jew. In signing this document, Thibon claimed to act in the name of the heirs of Mademoiselle Weil, for whose manuscript he possessed the copyright. The book became La Pesanteur à la Grâce. Until now, hardly anyone has paid attention to this contract, although it has been in print since 2012. Nor has anyone explained, let alone acknowledged, the book's highly suspicious publishing history. After the contracted volume first appeared with a 1947 copyright date, the same text was copyrighted a second time in 1948. The 1947 copyright imprint is extremely rare, but the 1948 copyright imprint is widely available. Then 3 more copyright dates followed from Plon for 3 consecutive volumes closely related to the 47-48 book. These 3 volumes, 1, 1951, 2, 1953, and 3, 1956, named Cahiers, notebooks, totaling over 1,000 pages, together offered a print version of the roughly 1,000 manuscript pages that Thibon had transformed to the 200-page La Pesanteur et la Grâce. His volume had a lengthy justificatory introduction. The 3-volume Cahiers offered hardly any introduction and no explanation of its relationship to its 1-volume predecessor. After the birth of Simone Weil in 1909 and her death in 1943, in the course of 8 decades, the 47-48 book has come to be hailed as the great gateway to her thought and life. Pesanteur à la Grâce began her transformation from a Jew, a Marxist militant, into an icon revered by popes and Nobel laureates, a hero in France, and a saintly mystic for the world. The 47-48 book has been a publishing sensation. In France, roughly 7 printings in rapid succession, later even more in the rest of the world and in multiple translations. Janet Flanner's Genet column in The New Yorker touted the pious excitement in Paris that the deceased Weil was generating. Despite all this adulation, the 51, 53, 56 Cahiers, the version closest to directly reproducing Simone Weil's own work, sold so badly that in the midst of publication, Plon threatened to drop the project before completion. Her brother was forced to compose a letter of appeal to devoted readers of Weil to buy the first 2 volumes so that the third would be printed. Within the introduction to the 1947-48 book, Thibon had incorporated a May 1942 missive from Simone Weil in toto, or so he alleged, as an imprimatur, a license to control her manuscript. No one has yet studied this letter along with its variants. Arguably, the version that Thibon chose to print instigated the entire Weil phenomenon. But first, in the history of books, the better the packaging, the better the sales, the greater the attention. Simone Weil was no exception. On Thursday, 16 February 1978, during a modest meeting at Princeton University, that issue was raised in very serious company. Two of the major figures in the reception and diffusion, respectively, of her posthumous oeuvre participated. The highly influential cultural essayist Susan Sontag and Simone's only sibling, André Weil. More than a decade, Sontag had solidified Simone Weil's reputation in the U.S. through an article in the historic 100,000 copy sell-out first number of the New York Review of Books. It appeared during the print-starved months of the New York Times strike of 1962-63. André Weil was not only a world-renowned mathematician, colleague of J. Robert Oppenheimer at the Institute of Advanced Study. He was also the older brother, mentor, quasi-twin, object of her emulation and envy. And by 1978, the sole heir to her intellectual property and her most effective, legitimate literary executor. As Sontag suggested, practically every Weil book title is a posthumous creation. A fact that cannot be emphasized enough, though it is persistently ignored. No book represents her own final cut. Literary executors and editors, in her case, were even more powerful than she, the author. Susan Sontag was among the first to raise this problem, unfortunately only in passing. Her brief comments were cited within one essay in a very insightful collection, Simone Weil Interpretations of a Life, published in 1981, edited by George Abbott White. I am honored that he is attending today's event, as he had the gathering at Princeton 47 years ago. Susan Sontag called attention to the polarized nature of the packaging of Simone Weil in the English-speaking world. The most prominent framers were at odds. The New York anti-war, one-time Trotskyist intellectual Dwight MacDonald, and the expat monarchist poet T.S. Eliot. Because of MacDonald's publication of her early essays in his little magazine, Politics, well respected by intellectuals on the Greenwich Village to Harvard Square circuit, she became a militant pacifist. Because of Eliot, in quote, people thought of her as a very original kind of Catholic mystic. Back then, again, to quote Sontag, everything that had a preface by T.S. Eliot commanded attention. He was, quote, the king of letters, the most influential literary figure he was the king of letters, the most famous literary figure whose influence was enormous. Sontag did not exaggerate Eliot's worldwide role in promoting Weil, but she failed to note his accompanying anti-Semitism, misogyny, intellectual carelessness, and his sympathies for what I call fascism, that distinctive combination of faith, foi, fascism, and authoritarianism that figures so prominently among many of Weil's promoters, as well as to a degree within her own thought. The problem of framing that Sontag identified reverberates with what has befallen her in France. The commitments of her premier handler, the above-mentioned Thibon, have been repeatedly suppressed by many scholars of Weil. He was a lifelong follower of Eliot's extreme right-wing monarchist soulmate, Charles Maurras, who in turn praised Thibon to the heavens. During the 1930s, Thibon, an acolyte of Nazi sympathizers, most notably Ludwig Klages, had been a Pétainiste avant la lettre. Later, Le Figaro called Thibon the Sage of Vichy, and Le Monde dubbed him Pétain's favorite philosopher. Post-Pétain and post-war, his politics were unrepentant. He supported Holocaust denialists such as Jean-Marie Le Pen's National Front and opposed Vatican II. Thibon and his clerical colleague, the Dominican missionary Joseph-Marie Perrin, were each separately responsible for editing and framing in a highly tendentious fashion Weil's rough manuscripts to produce two crucial early books, the already introduced La Pesanteur et la Grâce, remember 47-48, and Attente de Dieu from 1950. That volume appeared in English as Waiting on God, or Waiting for God. Together, her most widely read works. The contrast between MacDonald and Eliot has gotten, to a degree, more attention than what emerged in France. The Nobel laureate Albert Camus, secular hero of the resistance, played the part most like MacDonald's, but never as openly. To begin, his differences with the Pétainiste pair were oblique and understated, and subsequently never properly recognized. He never explicitly revealed that he knew what they had done to Simone Weil's intellectual legacy. What he learned from her family subtly surfaced in the best known and most misunderstood statement ever made about Simone Weil. Before turning to those famous words, a cleanup correction of yet another misunderstanding is essential. Camus' relation to Weil's third major early work. The editorship of L'Enracinement, Paris 1949, English Need for Roots, has often been attributed to Albert Camus. But in truth, the actual Gallimard editor was Brice Perrin, who had spent much of the war as assistant to the notorious Nazi collaborator Pierre de La Rochelle, a fact barely recognized. At the behest of the press's owner, Gaston Gallimard, Camus allowed Perrin's edition of Weil's manuscript to appear in a series bearing Camus' name. But Camus himself had almost nothing to do with it. Camus' differences with Thibon, Perrin, and to a lesser degree, parents, have been consistently ignored. Famously, Albert Camus described the late Simone Weil as the, quote, as the only great spirit of our time. Long neglected are the words that immediately followed. And I hope that those who recognize this will have enough modesty not to try to seize control of her staggering testimony. Enough modesty not to try to seize control of her staggering modesty. Camus' 1951 statement did not become known until the mass circulation L'Express published it shortly after his death in 1960. No one ever cites the conclusion of that sentence extracted from a letter of gratitude to Simone's mother, Selma Reinhardt Weil, for what together they had accomplished. They had just finished editing a collection of her deceased daughter's essays from the 1930s about labor, immersive spiritual and practical meditations on oppression. La condition ouvrière, the condition of labor. This book has never been published in English and has not yet gained the worldwide adulation visited upon the other three titles, La Pesanteur, Attente, et Le Renseignement. Camus never publicly attached his name to praise for those books. But he did for La Condition Ouvrière, which on the pages of L'Express in December 1955, he described as, and I quote, the greatest, the most noble book that has appeared since the liberation. These words, quote, the most noble book, close quote, from 1955, directed against La Pesanteur, Attente, and Le Renseignement, should put the lie to the false assumption that he valued those three books above all. Certainly not Le Renseignement, whose editorial control has long been misattributed to Camus. What he wrote about La Condition Ouvrière has never gained the attention bestowed upon that truncated statement, the only great spirit of our age. Certainly, in light of his praise for her essays on labor, that claim has less to do with those three Pétainiste books than has been imagined. Camus' words to Simone Weil's mother in 1951, published in 1960, and his article from 1955 demand the careful attention that they have never gained. And so we repeat the full sentence. Simone Weil, I call attention to the full sentence. Simone Weil, I know it even better now, is the only great spirit of our time. And I hope that those who recognize this will have enough modesty not to try to seize control of her staggering testimony. What had Camus come to know while working with Selma Weil? He learned that Thibon's contract with Plon was an attempt to hijack Simone Weil's legacy. He also knew that since 1947, the Weils had been fighting Thibon to retrieve it. Much of the evidence of theft and fraud has been lying around in plain sight for decades, but no one has connected the dots. In 1947-48, the bizarre double copyright of Pesanteur should suggest that the copyright was fishy. What better explanation might be for the disappearance, relatively speaking, of the 47 volume and its replacement in 48 by the exact same text, but bearing a new 1948 copyright date. Negotiations to address the fight over copyright probably temporarily suspended publication. In 1951, 53, 56, the appearance in print of a version of Weil's manuscript, the cahier, should have spurred a detailed comparison in the Republic of Letters between these two books. But no such investigation then took place. That had to wait half a century and still remains largely ignored. In 1981, the complete text of the letter from Weil to Thibon that he had deployed, allegedly in full, as the imprimatur in his introduction to La Pesanteur et la Grâce, was at last published and subsequently twice reprinted. But despite such persistent availability, no one has compared the two. At least in 2005, the first steps were at last taken, but only the first step by way of comparison. Marie-Annette Fourneron published a phrase-by-phrase comparative concordance, allowing the resurrection of the manuscript contents from which Thibon had extracted Simone Weil's words. In other words, he took the text as organized by Thibon in La Pesanteur et la Grâce, and she then located where those phrases and those words appeared in the original manuscript as subsequently published by Gallimard. There was a full edition of the cahier, supplanting that early one from the 50s. In roughly 20 instances, he added phrases of his own, including the title of the book itself, his invention, the names and the organization of every chapter, his inventions. Most strikingly, the opening lines of the book were his. He assembled scattered sentences and phrases composed over years into unified paragraphs. He cut and pasted words with no acknowledgement of the surgery that amputated the original context. He removed the corrections they had introduced into her text through question marks and parenthetical interjections. He eliminated all shades of doubt and hesitation from Simone Weil's thought. I suggest that the book is a collection of inspiring fridge magnet poetic aphorisms reflecting his own world view. In fact, the striking Pascal-like aphorisms distinctive to the book and noted by admirers were characteristic of his style, not hers. Unfortunately, Fourneron's tour de force led nowhere. Among all the studies devoted to Simone Weil, composed in more than a dozen languages, roughly 6,000 and counting, not one has built upon what should be Fourneron's foundational work. It should have offered a meticulous template for dozens of doctoral dissertations, but it has been ignored. Perhaps because La Pesanteur et la Grâce hybrid of Thibon and Weil was so brilliant. On a journey of recovery from alcoholism, the English writer and broadcaster Octavia Bright chose pseudepigraphic Simone Weil / Gustave Thibon as her companion. While visiting a church in the French countryside, an American working in Saudi Arabia experienced the deeply affecting paradox of mystical realism through pseudepigraphic Simone Weil / Gustave Thibon's writings discovered in a bookstall. A dancer from Quebec was so moved by what she glimpsed of the transcended aphorisms that she chanced upon in a collection on a library shelf that she abandoned her art for a pseudepigraphic Simone Weil Gustave Thibon. Would they have been equally inspired had they realized that the author was not a brilliant graduate of the École Normale Supérieure, a passionate defender of the oppressed, a volunteer for the Republic against Franco, a Jewish and the resistance, a volunteer for the Republic against Franco, and for the resistance against Hitler, a Jewish woman persecuted by the Holocaust, but rather something very different. An amalgamation of that figure with its antithesis. As asserted at the outset, the Plon-Thibon contract's goal was to produce a book bearing the name of the one-time militant Marxist Jewess Simone Weil, who had abandoned her roots and seen the light. Consolation particularly inspiring for the many Pétainistes rendered despondent by the conviction and imprisonment of their hero for treason. Thibon's version of Weil's life story mattered more than Weil's genuine thought in forging the particular identity and success of the book. This is also a tale of two contracts. Now is the time to introduce the second, dated 4 years later, 25 October 1950, the quasi-resolution of the Weil-Thibon conflict. The contract and what it represented inspired the long-forgotten second half of that most famous sentence ever written about Simone Weil. What Camus wrote Selma Weil just a few months later, and L'Express published in the next decade. I hope that those who recognize this will have enough modesty not to try to seize control of her staggering testimony. The 24 May 1946 contract assigned all rights and royalties to Thibon. Overturning that contract, the later contract stipulated that copyright, though not all royalties, belonged to the only heirs, Dr. and Mrs. Bernard Weil, Simone's parents. Henceforth, the royalties were to be divided, 3/4 for the Weils and 1/4 for Thibon. Thibon was not required to disgorge what he had earned from 1947 to 1950, or admit any prior wrongdoing. Recognition of Simone Weil's parents as the true heirs opened the contract. The next lines introduce their daughter, décédée à Ashford, Kent, le 24 août 1943, deceased in Ashford, Kent, at 24 August 1943. We will shortly return to that clause and that portentous date. The contract specified that the cahier from which Thibon had extracted La Pesanteur would also be published by Plon, creating multiple conflicts of interest. Now the thief, Thibon, and his victims, the Weys, became uneasy partners. Had the Cahiers gone to a rival house, a campaign might have been mounted to expose what Thibon had perpetrated, arousing a major literary scandal, drawing attention to the Cahiers, and encourage, that is the 3-volume version, and encouraging its sales. But that would have undermined Plon's and, unfortunately, the Weys' financial interest in Thibon's fabrication, what had now become 3/4 their own book. Plon had no desire to properly promote the Cahiers and undermine La Pesanteur, a reliable cash cow. Particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the Weys lacked the resources to mount such a campaign, had they even been able to imagine it. They had just returned to France after nearly a decade of constant exile, wandering from France to the United States, to Brazil, to Switzerland. Their sole breadwinner, André Weil, was denied a post in France commensurate with his talents. In 1947, they finally reached France, but their son had to remain in the Americas to support them. And his own family, his own family, the post brought him from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, to the University of Chicago in 1947. And finally, not until years after these fraught negotiations, in 1958, to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Scattered over oceans and continents, there were two dispersed and lacking resources to fight Thibon. Remember, well-connected and well-established in France. Back in those years following the war, the idea that survivors of the Holocaust had the right to claim reparations was hardly imaginable. The idea that victims could successfully sue the thief to recover their property had not yet become a U.S. Supreme Court case and the script for an acclaimed Hollywood movie. Had the confident and cantankerous André Weil been able to resettle in France, he could have begun to expose what Plon and Thibon had done. And the history of Simone Weil's books might have been very different. So the sides came up with this contentious compromise. The contract recognized the Weils' ownership of their daughter's stolen intellectual property. The agreement between the parties purged Thibon of all crimes. What of that May 1942 letter from Simone Weil that Thibon had flaunted as an imprimatur? It also stymied the unbridled fight that should have been waged. The Weils felt that Thibon had stolen and distorted their daughter's thought, but they respected the friendship and authority that the letter seemed to accord him. Accordingly, they could not attack Thibon with full force. But the letter included a peculiar condition that did give the parents a compelling legal argument against Thibon. That condition also explains the death date prominent within the later contract. Here is the relevant section of Weil's letter, according to Thibon's supposedly verbatim version. I do not know if I have told you with regard to the notebooks. This is Weil to Thibon. I do not know if I have told you with regard to the notebooks. You can read the passages that you wish, to whom you wish, but you must leave none of them in the hands of anyone. And then an ellipsis, which everyone has ignored, followed by, if during 3 or 4 years you hear no talk of me, consider that you have complete ownership of them. And immediately following in Thibon's version, I am saying all of this to you, so I go away with a freer mind. This is a dramatic statement. Without challenge since 1947-48, it has been accepted at face value. Counting 3 or 4 years from late May 1942, the date that they wrote him, revealed the key frontier of control, the buffer zone, sometime between May 1945 and May 1946. Within that time frame, that year-long time frame, was the earliest period he could assert his claim, quote, to complete ownership. By signing the contract on 24 May 1946, he could claim he was respecting her wishes in a patient way. After all, he could have signed it a year earlier. But there was a date present in the later contract, absent in what was signed earlier in 1946. 24 August 1943, the day of Simone Weil's death in Ashford, Kent. That date was well before the end of the publishing purgatory in which Simone Weil had placed Gustave Thibon, May 45 to May 46. Simone Weil's letter was not a will. It was a time-limited and specific grant. Until the transitional period, May 45 to 46, was reached, Thibon had no right of control. Under French law, and this is crucial, the death on 24 August 1943 rendered the grant to Thibon null and void. She died intestate, thereby immediately transferring all her estate, including her intellectual property, to her heirs, her parents. That is why 24 August 1943 appears in the first paragraph of the later contract, but not in the 46 contract. That date denied Thibon ownership and made the Weils the sole heirs. And that is why Gustave Thibon was ultimately forced to abrogate the contract of 1946. It was illegal. At this point, yet another complication must be added to this tale of contracts and conflicts over intellectual property, over and above the French law of inheritance. Thibon made a point of claiming that he was quoting Weil's letter in full. As you have suspected by now, that is not true. Thibon's version of her letter was yet another exceedingly clever fraud, a brilliant example of preserving some of her words while undermining their meaning. He did this as one might cut and splice an old-fashioned reel of tape recording. His mastery of cut and paste misrepresentation was remarkable, as Fourneron demonstrated in 2005. It was one of his greatest skills. Comparing key passages of her letter from one version to the next exposes his method and intent. The same complete text of her letter has been available in print repeatedly in 1981, 2012, and 2014, but it has been ignored until now. Herewith, from her full letter, what Thibon excised, now restored and underlined bold. This will be slightly familiar, but significantly different. I do not know if I have told you with regard to the notebooks, you can read the passages that you wish, to whom you wish, but you must leave none of them in the hands of anyone. And now we finally fill in that ellipsis. Except naturally Father Perrin and also Joël Bousquet. I would like Joël Bousquet to see some of them among the latest. His address, 53 Rue de Verdun, Carcassonne. Continuing, if during 3 or 4 years you hear no talk of me, consider that you have complete ownership of them. The next omitted section. For the same hypothesis, I ought to tell you that Joël Bousquet has in hand a copy of the scheme of my piece that has been slightly modified, and that it is the correct one. I don't remember if I sent you the final version of the last 2 pages. I am attaching them. Note whom he, Thibon, cut. Perrin, and particularly Bousquet, the mystery man in the story. We will get to him shortly. Please be patient, for still more distortion intervenes. The poignant farewell, heartfelt, that Thibon set at the conclusion of his version of the donation of Simone Weil, quote, I am saying all of this to you so I go away with a freer mind, in fact, does not appear immediately after the expression of the donation, but rather hundreds of words later in a very different context. The, quote, all of this does not refer exclusively to the donation, but rather to a grab bag to-do list in which the hypothetical donation was one among many errands. As for the rest of the letter, Thibon fair enough removed some personal references and reminiscences about the warm hospitality extended her when she worked in Thibon's family vineyards. But Weil did not end her letter on such a personal note about the Thibon family. The final words, the postscript, concern once again Joël Bousquet and her insistence that Thibon contact him about Hinduism. This was the spiritual interest preoccupying her that she shared with Bousquet and that she attempted to share with Thibon as well. The final paragraph, excised by Thibon, is now presented, again in underlined bold. You probably still have the typewritten translation of Sanskrit texts, Upanishad and Bhagavad Gita, that I sent to you. Send it on my behalf, please, to Joël Bousquet, asking him, if you wish, to send it back to you after reading. But I really want him to be able to read this. Don't forget to do it. I believe he will find joy there. And he needs it. The repeated appearance of Joël Bousquet, Weil's efforts to put him and Thibon together, through her translation of Sanskrit texts, along with Thibon's systematic elimination of Bousquet, suggests that Bousquet, as far as the notebooks were concerned, was key in Weil's own view of how her work might reach readers. It suggests, quote, a hypothesis, unquote, Weil's term, about her posthumous oeuvre, very different from the definitive assertion of total unilateral control that Thibon fabricated. At this point, we have to enter the hypothetical world that Simone Weil anticipated. Two friends, Perrin and Bousquet, should immediately, along with Thibon, have privileged access to the notebooks. Bousquet, in particular, should receive additional sections from Thibon soon. The phrase for the same hypothesis following complete ownership suggests Thibon's control is conditioned not only on her death, but also on what emerges from the troika she has created. His control is a hypothesis linked to the involvement of others, Bousquet more prominently. Bousquet has the correct version of the scheme for, quote, my piece, presumably the notebooks, the cahiers. He, and not Thibon, first received the final version of the last 2 pages of the scheme. Who is the mystery man, Joël Bousquet? Why was Thibon so determined to deny him any role in her notebooks? Bousquet was one of several significant French cultural figures who have been largely written out of the history of Simone Weil. They include the transgressive ex-seminarian Georges Bataille, father of French postmodernism, and author of one of the most important pornographic novels of the 20th century, one of the most important French pornographic novels of the 20th century, in which Weil plays a significant role. Another figure under-attended to, Boris Souvarine, a fallen founder of the French Communist Party, anti-Stalinist biographer of Stalin, and would-be biographer of Weil. René Daumal, poet, Hindu guru, Sanskrit scholar since lycée days. With others, they formed a contentious bohemian coterie of Marxists, surrealists, semi-surrealists, anti-surrealists, anti-Marxists, mystics, and disillusioned Jews and Catholics. Bousquet was one of the last to join a circle of friendships that stretched back into the late 1920s. He was a major poet, long engaged with avant-garde artists and thinkers, but he is barely known to Anglophones since little of his work has been translated. He aided the resistance and was a stalwart of Cahiers du Sud, the leading opposition journal of culture during the occupation. He was not Thibon's kind of man. What might have been the product of such a troika, and how might it have rewritten a digest of her notebooks? At the very least, the Gita and the Upanishads would have gotten close to equal time with the Gospels, and Krishna would have become a source of inspiration alongside Christ. Thibon and Perrin's Catholicism was too parochial to countenance such deviations from orthodoxy, however. But if they had any respect for Weil's wishes, they might have acquiesced to a degree. More likely, the fate of this tripartite board of editors would follow the patterns of other troikas. It would have fallen apart. Thibon's decision to eliminate Bousquet was right if the only goal was producing a book. But if it was wrong, if the goal was to reflect her thought and her own intentions. I've introduced Joël Bousquet as a deus ex machina, one of the many missing figures who I argue in my book, The Work in Progress, The Mysteries of Simone Weil, who I argued in this book were crucial in shaping her world. Bousquet was not only hypothetically imagined by Weil as co-editor of my piece, he was also the recipient of the practically unknown first version of her quasi-conversion narrative. The second version was famously published by Father Perrin in the best-selling Attente de Dieu as her spiritual autobiography. That Perrin-promoted essay has justified a major claim in her hagiography. During the 1930s, Simone Weil allegedly experienced 3 miraculous encounters with the divine that culminated in Jesus Christ taking possession of her when Benedictine chanting inspired her at the Abbey of Salem during Holy Week 1938. The first draft of this so-called spiritual autobiography, what she sent to Bousquet just days earlier, differed significantly. It was much vaguer, lacking references to time and place. The letter to Bousquet challenges the oft-repeated claim that profound encounters with Christ had miraculously begun in the 1930s. The Christ culminating moment in her narrative, composed for the priest Perrin, took place in an abbey around Easter 1938. The Christ culminating moment in her narrative for the poet Bousquet took place at some unnamed place, at an undated later moment, as she was reading the poem Love by George Herbert, to which she had been introduced in that basilica in 1938. There is nothing wrong with reimagining one's past through autobiography. It is the nature of the genre. But there is something wrong with biographers ignoring conflicting autobiographical musings and expressions, treating only one as the historically reliable narrative and giving no heed whatsoever to the other. The differences between what she confided to Bousquet and Perrin within the space of a few days in May 1942 are consistent with an insight of her brother and an unpublished letter to his friend, the eminent philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 4 July 1953. André Weil, casting doubt on what Thibon and Perrin were writing about his sister, suggested that she communicated with Thibon and Perrin dans leur langage. With special intensity during the years of persecution and war, when survival was at risk, Simone Weil had a tendency to tell people what they wanted to hear. Varying her voice from audience to audience and contradicting herself to herself. Almost nothing of her and about her can be accepted at face value, particularly after the fall of France destroyed her world, imposing upon her the duplicity of Vichy. Rewriting the entire history and thought of Simone Weil is long overdue. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And we're happy to take questions from anyone if you want to raise your hand physically or use the raised hand sign.
Or you could also put them in chat for the
or in the chat, we can read them, whatever
moderators.
works better for you. Let me take a look at the chat, 1 second. Those are all just general comments there. Anybody with a question yet? Otherwise, I can invoke the host privilege. I'm not sure this quite how to formulate this, Ben, but I guess one of the things that's so fascinating about your topic is that she has these multiple orientations, let's call them that seem incompatible with some others, and that people on various sides of the political and intellectual spectrum have tried to appropriate her, if that's the word,
or hijack her or whatever.
Yeah. So I guess I was wondering, given the plethora of Vichy sympathizers in France, many of whom were prominent intellectuals, even if they were dead, like Grazillac and Drieux and so forth, why did they latch on to her? Because it works two ways. She's problematic in some ways for the Pétainists, and she's also problematic for the resistance people. I don't know if that's an intelligible enough question for you.
Why was she the object? Well, because she was she was protean.
Mm-hmm.
And the protean aspect allowed many different interpretations, because there were all of these different voices, all these very different voices coming out of her. I think that so she was useful for a lot of different purposes. Excuse me. So I think let's just talk about two different groups that were particularly eager to latch onto her. She was very important for the defeated Pétainistes. She was an archetype of the, so it seemed, of the Third Republic, a product of the École Normale Supérieure, the elite pinnacle of French higher education. She was born a Jew. She was a Marxist. She was a militant. She was a labor activist. She really embodied so many of the aspects of the Third Republic that they detested, and that Pétain came to power to overthrow. And they could now create her as a symbol of the failure of that voice. And she had seen the light, according to the version that Perrin and Thibault promulgated. She had seen the light. She recognized the truth of the gospel. Now, she hadn't. I mean, it was contradictory, but they were very, very eager to push her forward, very, very eager to push her forward as a consolation prize for the defeat of Pétain and this devastating loss that Vichy represented for a very, very substantial part of the population, particularly devout Catholic population in the country. Remember, despite, as we well know, despite de Gaulle's claim that everyone supported the resistance. At the beginning of the war, Pétain's at the beginning of the occupation, I should say, Pétain's support was overwhelming, and even towards the end, he still had a substantial number of followers. So there was that desire to try to come up with some way of consoling themselves. And then there was the other problem, which is the left. As I said, Camus didn't really attack Thibon. I mean, that statement about that was at the end of that famous quote. It really is quite. It was really quite strange that it was just forgotten. The other part of it was that this is a period, and this is also part of Camus' commitment in the aftermath of the war. It was necessary to come up with a reconciliation, with an irenic approach. They didn't really want to stir the pot and create another controversy, another fight. They had just been through that. They had, the Second World War was a civil war in France. And they didn't want to reignite the civil war. So Simone Weil became a useful object of this. She could play two roles. She could be, for the right and the Ancien Regime, a symbol of a Jeanne d'Arc type character, with her visions and her possessions and her saintliness. And given her revolutionary history in the 30s, she could also become a Marianne figure. So she embodied these two elements, and therefore all sides just accepted that. So that was one role that she could play. The other role, and I emphasized this at the beginning when I said that she was, that Thibon stressed the fact that she was a Jew. I mean, his introduction was a confession of his own anti-Semitism, though for some reason no one has wanted to acknowledge that. He says that I am not a priori anti-Semite. So presumably once he has the evidence to justify the case, he's a post facto anti-Semite. And so it just makes that point. So it's clearly he was kind of waving this Jew as his trophy convert saint to advocate for his position. But
Ben,
what?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just let me finish this one point, George, and I'll pick it up. And the other thing is this question of how do they relate this to the Holocaust? And this is going to be quite the way in which she was placed in the Holocaust and placed out of the Holocaust is very, very problematic. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that this second, but if that is a subject of interest to any of the 60 or so people who are still around, I'd certainly be happy to respond. George, did you want to say something? This is George.
Yeah, I found all of this very interesting, but maybe well, and one response I have is a lot simpler, and that is that she was very, very, very smart, not clever, but smart. She asked great questions, and that kept the wheel spinning. But she also was very needy. I say that, in terms of the sexist world that she was in, which seems to have gotten left out from a number of things. She was very needy. She goes off to the Spanish Civil War and gets boiling oil or water poured on herself. She proposes, a flyover so that she can be a nurse behind the lines. She's obviously incapable of all kinds of really very basic, very simple kinds of things. And I think that I don't know about latching on, but I do think that you know, for people who are not just intellectuals but are teachers and have ideas, that she was someone that, if you dared, would like to help her or felt a need to help her.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just looking at the chat, and I'm also looking. I know that Christine Evans saw
Right.
you raised your hand. I'm not sure if I missed anybody else.
Christine was the first, I believe, and then three in the
Okay.
chat. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
please.
thanks so much. Benjamin, I found very interesting the background you gave on the letters and the emphasis that you put on the fact that Simone Weil wanted Joy Bousquet to be part of this project, which, as you say, would have created a very different. I'm sure it would not have created a very different La Pesanteur et la Grâce. It would have created a very different uh, understanding of her cahier, of the notebooks themselves. But I have a couple of questions and remarks. So both Perrin and Thibon um, readily admitted that this was their interpretation of Simone Weil, not kind of the gospel. And it was a conversation with her. It was a conversation that they were having with her thought. It was in that spirit, I think, that they put together La Pesanteur et la Grâce. Also, the former president of the uh, Simone Weil Society in France said, yes, everyone, if they're doing research, they should take the cahier. They should do it from the basis of the published cahier. However, if you're going to be taking Simone Weil on a mountain walk and hike, and you want to read her, you're not going to take the cahier. You're going to take La Pesanteur et la Grâce to read and to contemplate. So it has I don't think now Weil scholars, I'm quite sure that they no longer depend upon this as the final form of the cahier. They realize that it's this compilation done by these two men with a very specific agenda. In the book that they wrote, Simone Weil as We Knew Her, they predicted that she would have accepted baptism had she just lived a little bit longer. So this is
I'm
really
sorry, I missed something. You said, I'm sorry, Christine. You said they predicted what, and then I missed what you
that
said.
she would have accepted baptism in Catholicism
Oh.
if she had only had the chance to live a little bit longer. This is obviously one view of Simone Weil, and it's very much their view. And I don't think they hide it in that book, that they have a very specific view of Simone Weil. So it's a wonderful, I consider it's a wonderful book, La Pesanteur et la Grâce. But it is not the cahier. It is a very different object. And I have just one question about the Weil family. Um, you said that after the war, they had no money to pursue a lawsuit and they were too dispersed to fight. Is there evidence that they wanted to fight this contract and they wanted to dispute it? Or is it just kind of common sense that they would have?
Yes, the evidence actually, I think 2015, I think you hosted the meeting of the Weil Society at Leslie.
Right, yeah.
And I don't know if you, and I organized a exhibit, a sort of mini private exhibit for us in Houghton Library, in which I put on display a few dozen documents from the Houghton archives. And I was hoping, I was hoping that this would encourage people to pursue this source. 10 years ago, no one has, other than
there is a proof that they wanted to contest this.
Yeah, and the evidence is in the archive compiled by her would-be biographer, Boris Souvarine, which has extensive correspondence between Selma Weil and Boris Souvarine about how to deal with what Thibault had done. And going back and forth. And it's also that same archive also has extensive material about the circumstances which led to the publication of Le Renseignement, which is one of the reasons why I'm removing Camus from the editorship, because we know who was involved and who wasn't. So yes, there's definite evidence. And then I also have evidence later that in correspondence of André Weil, in which he describes the repeated efforts to control what Thibault and Perrin had done to their daughters, sisters' work. And they were repeatedly protesting to publishers to try to make some changes. And this is an important principle. In French intellectual property law, there are two different forms of droit regarding a manuscript which is published. This droit moral and the copyright. And the copyright extends to royalties and contractual arrangements for publishing. The droit moral applies to the content. In other words, someone is not allowed to distort or misrepresent the original intent of a work. And the Weils were constantly struggling with publishers and with, I won't go through the details right now about what they felt was being misrepresented in Simone's.
So Benjamin, just a final comment, and so absolutely. But there are a lot of different Weils, according to whoever is reading her. And I'm not sure that the Weil family had any more right to her in terms of owning the interpretation than someone else. So that money is one thing, but defining and owning her thought is something quite different.
I'm sorry, I disagree with you. But because according to French law, the interpretation is one thing, you're right. But the actual text and the words accompanying the text, according to French law, is the droit moral. And the Weil family had the right to control what people were saying as in her name and with her appended to her name. There was a very famous case in French intellectual property law, in which dating from the 19th century, in which the court ruled that when a publisher took over the work of the manuscript of a book, the reprint, an English book had come out, a French publisher bought rights to publish it in France. The French publisher then changed the content of the book. The English author sued. The French court ruled that the English author had the right to demand the pulping of the book. I mean, that's pretty serious. Now, you're right, absolutely, as far as interpretation, that's a completely different story. So there was a lot more, there's a lot more gravity attached to droit moral in France than, and its unfamiliar approach. Now, I did have another, I don't know, George, I think Kenneth Novus raised an interesting problem in the chat, but I don't know if I've missed anybody else, and I apologize if I have.
We've got three here, I think. We have
Sorry?
Jerry, Kenneth, and Aiden. Let's see.
Okay, once you, it's a little difficult for me to.
Stephanie.
And and Scott Rittner has his hand up.
Okay. Yeah, so if you want to follow from the chat, or either way, Ben, whatever you prefer.
Okay, well, not everybody can see that is necessarily following the chat. Let me just see. I begin with Jerry. Can you say anything about the difference in content? between the manuscripts and the published version of La Plaisanterie et la Grâce. Well, that is what I was bemoaning when I said this should have been when Fourneron did this magnificent study published in 2005. That should have been the basis of dozens of PhD theses saying, what is this difference? What does this mean? And no one has done it. It's like, I think, and I'm afraid I disagree with you, Christine, they're too ready to walk up on the mountaintop with what they imagine are these inspiring thoughts, and instead of looking at the sausage factory, which created these thoughts. And that's why you have to make a distinction. You can do this now, and that was the point of the Fourneron exercise, because the cahiers were fully published, have been now published in a very good scientific edition. But no one has really made that effort. I can make some generalizations in response to your question, Jerry, but I cannot really give a more. I'm not comfortable making a claim that my interpretation is definitive and it's not based on a thorough examination of the problem. But basically, what I'd say is that, and I indicated this, that the cahier Simone Weil was much more Hindu and much less Christian. Let me give you another example. In the early pages of the first one of the first attempts to publish the cahier, which was that 51, one of the first pages has a reference to German soldiers. And seeing a German soldier in uniform is not in and of itself a source of fear, but in this context it is. Now, that is an acknowledgement of the war and the position of France and they during the war. Thibon removed that. That does not appear in his version. He did not want to deal with Pétain's ally. He did not want to criticize him. So I don't know if that's, if you want to follow that up, Jerry, but I'm giving you just data points. I cannot give, no one has done the systematic work to make this clear. Now, Kenneth Novus. Okay, I know there's a difference between historians and philosophers on this kind of approach, and we're interested in the weeds and how something gets created. So I'm curious to know what difference this makes for philosophical research today. Yeah, you're saying that the issues with G&G are generally recognized and dutifully circumnavigated. I wish I could be as comfortable and confident about agreeing with you and agreeing with you and saying they haven't been dutifully circumnavigated, because no one has frontally confronted the circumstances which created this document. That is G&G, P&G, whatever you want to call it, Procter and Gamble's, Plaisanterie et la Grâce. So, and one of the problems is that the people who first edited the Gallimard Œuvre Complète had an interesting disagreement. The early editors basically accepted Thibon's work as completely legitimate, and they justified it and made no complaints about it. And the other Chevalier didn't agree, and he published an article in 2005 in which he criticized their work. But it's been it has not been frontally addressed and explained and explored in a way which would sort of make it clear that this is not something that should be regarded as a reliable work of hers. So I know that good scholars. I know that, but in France, in the Simone Weil Society, she is not considered part of the canon. But in the United States, I think the approach is a little different. A lot of reputable scholars still cite her as if she is legitimate and publish articles in a respectable journal. So I think part of the difference, Kenneth, is you're writing, of course, from the UK, and David Levy is in Edinburgh. And I think we have to recognize that in different countries, there are different approaches. And what you say in the UK may be correct, but what happens in and UK and France, but it's not the case in the United States, and elsewhere as well. So I think who else? I can go through the chat. I'm just Ado Perrin. Well, and I think this is a problem. Okay, in terms of, yeah, the trouble was, and this is, there was Thibon and Perrin created a disease in the Weil family, a reaction to introductions. And it was particularly true for Selma. She wanted no introductions. She felt that her daughter's work should be presented on its own. There was a kind of naive expectation that the words could speak for themselves. Consequently, all the volumes that Camus edited, which are quite important, lacked any kind of introduction, lacked any kind of formulation, and they never did the job of challenging the versions that Thibon and Perrin had presented. So it was like Selma Weil forced a kind of nuclear disarmament in Weil literature because their stuff, the stuff that they were advocating, was coming out with very little context or explanation, while the Thibon Perrin stuff was free to float around without being challenged. And there was simply no challenge to what they had done. And even to this day, I don't think there is much of a challenge, direct challenge to their formulation. Now, let me see. Then Mercedes Lopez, can you explain the methodological process here? So there was a lot of collation work in the BNF. Thank you for. Well, first of all, I did one of the things I did, and I could have done even more, is I did try to look at some of the most important, two of the most important essays in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in the Weil collection, because I wanted to look at the actual physical manuscripts, and I didn't have the time, and then COVID intervened, and I wasn't able to get back. But I think one of the problems with the Gallimard edition is they should have, and they should now, and they could do it, presented a photocopy, which is easily done, a digitalized photocopy of what her manuscripts look like. They do a few pages of that, because when you start looking at the way in which she actually wrote and what she rewrote and overwrote, you can see a lot of what is evident in terms of her thinking and her going back and forth. And to put this on a static page, which is what happens with the Gallimard edition, is to miss a lot of the nuance in what's going on. So that's one methodological issue. The other methodological issue is that I tried to look at this from as many perspectives as possible. And one of the important resources that I had, which is almost no one, with one exception, has looked at, and nobody has published significant amounts from this, is this collection that Boris Souverin assembled in Houghton. It's now in Houghton Library for a biography that he never wrote. And it is an incredible resource. It has not only correspondence with the family, which I indicated, but also correspondence, some correspondence, early correspondence with Simone. And he then started gathering material from a lot of different sources, which unfortunately no one has looked at. I've tried to systematically incorporate it into the mysteries of Simone Weil. So let me get back to, I don't know if Kenneth, I don't know if you're still around, and I would like to point out that, so I don't know if you're aware of this distinction between what scholars in the UK, what scholars in France, and what scholars in the US are doing with G&G. And I think it's not all the same. So
Ben, can I interject?
oh yeah, sure. Just a second. There's one. Alejandra, I just saw something in the chat. Have the manuscripts they sent to Biscay been found? Because no. And I think this is a major question. And in general, I don't think that the job of a forensic study of the transmission of the manuscripts, that is the chain of transmission of our manuscripts, has really been adequately addressed. The manuscripts were dispersed all over the world, and the Gallimard collection, and based on the in the Bibliothèque Nationale, should have been the occasion for doing that, but they failed to do it, and that was a mistake, and it still needs to be done. So I think, first of all, there has to be a forensic examination of the chain of transmissions of all her documents and all her, and it's been kind of done in a sporadic fashion. And the second thing is there should be a digitalized photographic version of the Cahiers and other major sources, because that would be a valuable resource. Okay, Scott, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ben.
Hi, good to see you again.
Hi, it's good to see you too.
May I introduce
long time.
Scott Redner, who's the president of the American Bay Society.
Hi, everybody. Ben, I really thank you for this talk. I remember very fondly that weekend in 2015 in Boston, and going through the Supreme Archive with you. And I think that one, I'm really happy that you are still pursuing this project. I mean, it's been a long time, and it seems to be really coming to the fore in a wonderful way. And I think what I'd like to say, and sort of as by means of a comment, is two things. First is that I think that your argument here and your research have very much been passed around by word of mouth amongst those of us who, I'm gonna call myself one of the younger generation of Bay scholars, even though I'm in my 40s already, and the rest of them are younger than me. But your work here has been passed down through all of us very much by word of mouth, and it's had a lot of influence on the way that many of us are reading Weil, along with the very useful, now digitized, I think somewhere, copy of Martin Andich's, when he went through Gravity and Grace and sort of found the corresponding passages in the English translation of the Cahiers as well, which
it's not as good as Forgeron.
Right,
is the gold standard.
Yeah, but I wanted to say that I very much, as someone who's a scholar, really appreciate that your work on this, and want you to know that it is reaching people, and the sort of younger generations of Bay scholars are taking these claims very seriously, and as Kenneth pointed out. The question that one quick other comment is that I do know also that coming from Routledge very soon is going to be a new volume called Dharma and Detachment, which was edited by a philosopher at Simon Fraser University Nick Bomarito, who very carefully went through the Kaya and all of those references to Hinduism and Indian philosophy, and has sort of built a new Gravity and Grace, but with the surrounding context of all the arguments and explanations of the references and things like that. I think what's really wonderful about your work then, and what I'm hoping you have something more to say about, is what the ramifications for the more general reading of Weil could be, for the non-scholarly, non-specialist reading of Weil. Because I agree, we have on the one hand people who are Weil scholars who we go to the notebooks. We do not spend our time in Gravity and Grace. But on the other hand, scholars who are not solely focused on Weil do, right? And so I'm curious as to well, one, I think that your scholarship is going to have a huge impact on the more general reading of Weil, and two, I'm curious as to what you think the sort of driving theme of that process might be.
Well, I'm not quite sure. I think the word I used earlier to talk about her was protean. And the protean to the degree of being profoundly contradictory and at war with herself. I wrote something in the book proposal, which I'm working on right now, is I described her as a Russian nesting doll, a matryoshka, in which each doll emerges and attacks the previous one.
Oh, I know about that.
And so there is, and that means, and some of the discoveries I've made are quite shocking. And I have to weigh how seriously I can take them, because the way in which they have worked themselves out is very complicated. At one point, according to a high-ranking official in the Pétainiste government, she offered her services as a nurse to the fascist volunteers fighting alongside the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front.
Well, that part of it,
and she wrote an article about this appeared in a notoriously right-wing scandal sheet called Rivarol. So the source is not reliable, but there's a lot about this report that makes it credible and is not inconsistent with other things she said.
Ben, wasn't that with de Gaulle? I don't how that got to Pétain.
No,
wasn't it with de Gaulle when she?
No, she was in November, around November 1941. She had a meeting with a guy named Maurice Gaillet, who was in Marseille at the time. And there was a local Marseille gangster who was trying to organize a volunteer group of really committed fascists. These were people who even Pétain couldn't stomach. And she wanted to aid them fighting alongside the Wehrmacht against the Red Army. So, I mean, Gaillet had more common sense than she did. And nothing came of this, and it's not clear how seriously she pushed it. But then a few months later, she wrote an article which appeared in a Pétainiste journal, which no one has talked about and has suppressed, which was festooned with quotations from Pétain's speeches. I mean, they were so there's that element. I mean, it's not clear that she knew that was happening, but she couldn't have been that naive, because she spent months hanging around this journal, and wrote to Thibon about this journal. How is she saying that she has, these are her friends? So this is really disturbing. And then she shows up in London in December 42. And I found the testimony, the vetting testimony that she gave the Resistance Counterintelligence Bureau. She went through the standard process of being interviewed to see if she was loyal and trustworthy. And in the course of that interview, she lied. She described Thibon. I'll tell you in a second, Christine. She described Thibon, and in a very strange, the French locution is very bizarre, as an anti-fascist, as writing for an anti-fascist. He should write for an anti-fascist journal. I mean, this is a woman who is all over the place.
Wow.
Now, the name of the journal is Économie et Humanisme, and the full run of it is in Harvard, in Leiden. And I've gone through the early issues, which were being published at the time she was hanging around them. And one of my arguments, which no one has yet voiced, is that Le Renseignement has to be seen as her version of Économie et Humanisme, that she in fact had integrated a lot of their thinking into what becomes a memo, a thinking from a kind of pro-Pétain perspective into what was supposed to be written for a Gaullist, as a Gaullist assignment. So there's a lot of fundamental contradictions involved with her, which
Pretty fundamental.
Which are very disturbing, and which make any kind of simple-minded admiration of her very difficult to maintain. Now, I think her writing, as Georgian has discussed with me, her writing on labor and factory is brilliant, insightful, but has never gotten the attention it deserves. La Condition Ouvrière, it's outrageous. This fundamental book has never been published in English because it doesn't conform to a kind of mystical, saintly, inspirational. It is inspirational, but under very different terms. Doesn't conform to the mystical, saintly, inspirational role niche that she has been placed in, and there are many more niches that she can fill. Now, fortunately, in 2024, that book was placed on the required reading list for the Agrégation in Philosophy, sponsored by the French Ministry of Education.
Huh.
And it was, and I thank Martine, I think you might still be for calling this to my attention, Martine Gontrel. And so it's clearly is getting more attention in France, and it has been continuously in print in France. And that was the book that Camus edited, compiled with Selma Weil. And that was the book that I argue inspired him to praise her as the great spirit of the age. It was not what Thibon and Perrin had produced, but this other work. So I see that you've uncloaked and come back, Martine. So I thank you again. I'm sorry, the translation, Scott, translation of what exactly?
La Condition Ouvrière.
Okay, but okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. So I just sent Ben a private message saying there's someone working on a translation right now.
Well, if you tell him to be in touch with me.
I will. Yeah, I'll introduce you to by email.
Okay.
Before the end of the week.
And by the way, Kenneth, if you're still around, you might just convey. I mean, I understand that the David Levy's. I mean, I welcome his comments and what he has done for his students. But the fact is that there's a kind of siloing of the approach to Weil in different regions, and districts and countries. And I think the journal, and I think there has to be, and it's partly a linguistic problem that Americans don't do enough investigation of the French sources. That's not a problem for those in the UK. But it's also that sort of everything is kept in separate lines of tradition. Sorry?
But I don't know. Oh, really? I don't know where. Wait, we're online. Ben, I have a question.
Okay, sure.
I may be the only literary person in the
Bienvenue. No, I think Christine Evans is too.
My question to you is, I love the way you use the word protein, and to
The word what?
Protein.
Oh, protein. Yes.
Protein.
My question to you is, I think she was a very literary person too. She had been very close to Buddhism. I mean, is there a way of looking at her writings as writings that try to bring love to everybody, including the SS members that she's dealing with? One possibility.
Absolutely. I mean, there was this kind, but it's in other words, the comments that she made, which can be seen to support the claim made by in Rivarol that she wanted to volunteer. She said, I cannot, and she said it in the article, but she also said it to other people, I cannot imagine the suffering of the people on the battlefield without wanting to come and protect them. Okay. But, does that mean that she was going to volunteer to go from one side to the other? I mean, these people are outright fascists. You have to be aware of whom you're dealing with. I remember I had an exchange with one scholar with whom I shared this report, and she said, he found it incredible, and he recognized that she might have thought this way, but he also, she would have been killed by them. They would have sent her off to a camp as soon as possible. There was this kind of completely otherworldly lack of recognition of the realities that she was dealing with. But on the other hand, she did have a realpolitik. She did have an element of realpolitik about her consciousness. George, would you mind muting? Sorry. See, she had an element of realpolitik about her consciousness. So, for instance, when she was in the States in 1942, her niece was born. A niece was born to her brother and sister-in-law, and Sylvie, who's played a very important part in shepherding Simone Weil's material to this day, and has written a crucial family memoir. And Simone wanted them to convert their daughter to baptize her. And she had an exchange of letters, which have been reprinted several times. And when she said, who knows what might happen if she's baptized, she'll be protected in case there is basic anti-Semitic discriminatory laws passed in these countries after the war. So it would do her good to have this position. Well, that's a somewhat cynical, somewhat realistic approach. It's one that many people took after the war because they felt it would be a good defensive posture. So there is that aspect of her which has to be joined and mixed with the other aspect that I have described. Yes, as far as the frontline nursing project go, the point about that frontline nursing project went through many different iterations. And she at one point tried to post it to the French government. When she was in the United States, she offered it to the Canadians. She offered it to the Red Cross, which would have been similar to what you were describing. But then in probably November of 41, she offered it to the League of French Volunteers, which was not interested in attending to the combat, to any combatants, but interested in their own interest. And this is a notorious gang. It was run by, I think his name is Sabiani, one of the gangster politicians in Marseille, completely unsavory character. By the way, Condition Ouvrière has also been translated into Chinese. So
it's not translated only to English, or
no, it's. I think someone said it's been. You just said it's been translated into Spanish.
Yeah, into Spanish, but not into English. And
well, I think it came out in the 50s, Cold War workers. I suspect it was politically not considered desirable. And then some of the essays were translated piecemeal. So that might have undermined some publishers' interest. But I think it is the fact that, and I think the degree of involvement that Camus had in this has not gotten recognition, because once again, there was no introduction. And I think if it was known as Camus' baby, if there was an introduction that said, this is what inspired Camus, that might get more attention.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just wondering if there are any. I'm looking at the chat comments, and I'm not sure if our colleagues, if our host, the gyms, can help. Are there any other questions which I haven't gotten to?
I don't see anything yet. I think you've answered the questions in the chat for the most part. Let's see, what else do we have here? Questions about labor and hostility and so forth from Scott, reflecting on where this book might be well received or not, and Lois. I was wondering, just out of curiosity, Ernst Jünger, the German author who was known for his works about World War I combat and then his kind of problematic relationship with the Nazi regime, he wrote an important book called The Worker also. It might be interesting to think about those in context even.
And Camus has some interesting things to say about Jünger as well. And as I recall, alongside around the same, and I'm trying to remember, it gets juxtaposed somehow, at least in my memory, to what he was writing about Simone Weil. So it's an interesting question, which I don't remember exactly, and I'm saying this off the top of my head after several days of COVID, so everything, it might be a garbled mess in my head.
It's been very coherent.
The other, let me, so I did mention, let me just sort of end on what will be probably the most controversial note. And one of the big questions is, and it's provoked a major work in France, many essays interestingly, in the United States, as well as in France, but not as far as I know in the UK, as to whether or not Simone Weil was an anti-Semite. And I think that none of the approaches to this questions have been adequate. And they've made a crucial mistake, two different crucial mistakes. The first is that they have failed to distinguish between what she wrote, and this gets us back that she did not publish any of her books. They have failed to distinguish between what she wrote and published in her own name and what she wrote but never published. The anti-Semitic writings that she did compose were published by Perrin and Thibon in their own interests. So that doesn't mean that she didn't have these thoughts. And Thibon and Perrin in different ways exaggerated and suppressed criticism of this. But the other problem is the way in which anti-Semites used her. And Holocaust denialists used her.
Yep.
And Thibon was, in fact, the prime character doing that. They were taking advantage of her to justify what had happened and to whitewash themselves. So it's a much more complicated question than whether she was an anti-Semite. It was, how did she approach that? And what's interesting is there are a number of different essays in which her anti-Semitism came out, but she wrote different versions of those essays. And she wrote one version of the essay, which she shared with Perrin, and another version of the essay that she shared with Jean Weil, who was a major French philosopher, Jewish, and with whom she sent a long letter. So she was, again, she spoke to people in her brother's phrase, dans leur langue. In other words, she spoke to people in their language. It wasn't clear what was her own commitment, because she was talking to people in the terms that they would accept and welcome. Now, Christine, she didn't want to become part of their think tank for the Free French. As I said, I've studied the actual testimony she gave them. She wanted to be on the front lines. She tried, and she went to MI6, and she actually started to train to become a telegrapher. And they kicked her to a backroom Siberia think tank, but that's not what she wanted. So I'm wondering if we have 8 minutes before our Zoom link turns into a pumpkin. If there are no more, I hope that I've responded to everybody. I'm quite interested in the utopian businessman Olivetti, of course, whose typewriters I used to work on years ago. So it's not my business to close us down.
I'm not seeing any other hands or questions in the chat. So I think, unless someone wants to jump in now, that we can thank you for excellent talk, very stimulating, and say how much we look forward to this book coming out. Obviously a lot to learn. So thanks for starting the semester for us, Ben. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for coming and sharing your thoughts. It's been very delightful and exciting to do so.